Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Responsible Wool Standards in Action. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Please specify the speaker you are directing your question to if appropriate. Any unanswered questions will be answered afterward via email. Now on to Hannah Dean, Senior Standards Manager at Textile Exchange, who will begin our webinar today. Hannah?
Thank you, Rose. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Hannah Deans from the Standards team at Textile Exchange, and with me I've got Trini and Callie from the Standards team. And if you email the standards at or responsiblewool at Textile Exchange email addresses, you'll most likely hear from Trini or Callie or myself. But before I get to the agenda, so I take the opportunity to introduce the broader standards team. We have grown a lot over the last year. We are now 9 people across the world. So if you're working with our standards, either becoming certified or sourcing certified material, you may come across one or more of us from the team. So in today's webinar, I'm going to start us off by giving an overview of version 2 of the Responsible Wool Standard, as well as an introduction to the Responsible Animal Fiber Framework. This is a very high-level overview. If you're interested in a more detailed overview of the version 2 of the Responsible Wool Standard, we held a webinar for the launch back in March that's available on the website. So I'd recommend that. And after this introduction, Trini is going to talk to us about chain of custody, how our chain of custody system works, and the most common questions we get about supply chain and brand certification. And she's also going to give an overview of labeling and claims and the upcoming revision of the content claim standard. Callie is going to take over and share some insights from brands that have worked with the RWS, what the process have looked like for them, the challenges that they've encountered along the way, and advice for brands that are interested in starting to work with the RWS. Last but not least, we'll take a look at the adoption of the standard to date, and we will also get some updates from grower groups on their available supply and their forecasts for the future. So if I could have that, there we go. So I'll start with an overview of the Responsible Wool Standard, which is a voluntary global standard that protects the welfare of sheep and the land that they graze on. In addition to the farm requirements for animal welfare and land management, the standard also provides a chain of custody from the farm to the final product, which Trini will talk more about. But taking a closer look at the farm scope of the standard and what that covers, can I have the next slide, please? I will focus in on that. So as I mentioned, the standard addresses animal welfare and land management, and in version 2 also introduces social welfare requirements. So the animal welfare requirements are broadly structured around the 5 freedoms and the updated approach to the 5 provisions. It's a comprehensive set of requirements that addresses nutrition, living environment, animal management, handling and transport, as well as the management plans and procedures that are needed. What you see on the screen are the desired outcomes that we have for each module of the standard, and below that sits a set of requirements. There are a small number of requirements regarding prohibited practices, such as mulesing being prohibited. There is also requirements around restricted practices and a broad set of requirements that are about promoting positive experiences and good animal welfare. Some of the key updates in version 2 is that mainly, we spent a lot of time in the revision looking at interpretation and clarification and developing more guidance materials. So the standard hasn't changed dramatically. There's been minor changes. We did introduce a new requirement addressing the issue of live shipping, prohibiting sheep knowingly being sold for live export. And an optional slaughter module has also been developed that can be used in conjunction with CCS to provide the chain of custody. Next slide, please. And here we have the desired outcomes for the land management module of the standard. So the land management module addresses soil health and grazing practices, biodiversity in water, as well as fertilizer and pesticides use. In version 2, similar to animal welfare, there's no drastic changes, but clarifications and tweaks and improvements. We have put a lot more emphasis around the biodiversity requirements, and I've introduced a biodiversity management plan, as well as some new water requirements. Another interesting update here as well is that we are starting to collect and aggregate information on regenerative grazing practices on RWS farms. These are the practices that rebuild soil organic matter and increase soil biodiversity and carbon sequestration. So through the farm questions, we're starting to build up a picture of the practices on certified farms. Next slide, please. And here's an example of one of the RWS farmers taking that work a step forward and actually looking at measuring the carbon sequestered on the farms in the Coe wool group. And next slide, please. In version 2 of the RWS, we also introduced a set of on-farm social welfare requirements. And here you have an overview of the desired outcomes for this module. The standard covers key ILO requirements around forced labor and child labor, as well as communities' health and safety and working conditions. And this is a new area for the standard that we are building up more guidance materials around. And next slide, please. During the revision of the Responsible Wool Standard, we also developed a Responsible Mohair Standard. The two standards were released together. And as part of this process, we created an animal welfare framework. And the next slide, we can take a closer look at that. So the animal welfare framework takes the desired outcomes for the standards and builds out the principles below those desired outcomes. And I think the next slide, we have an illustration of how the alignment between the wool and the mohair standard works in practice. The next screen, please. So here we have the Responsible Wool Standard and the Responsible Mohair Standard alongside each other. And as you can see, there is only one very minor difference. There are, the two standards are very well aligned, as they both address small ruminants in similar farming systems. But what the introduction of the animal welfare framework and this approach of aligning standards will work in practice for certification is going to differ depending on if it's the farm scope or the supply chain scope. So in the next slide, I've tried to illustrate that in a not very good graphic, and we will definitely work on a better way of illustrating it. But at the farm level, there are still separate scopes for RWS and RMS, but a farm or a group of farms may hold both. The textile exchange site fee only applies once, and we allow for remote audits for adding RMS certification to RWS farms. As the certified material moves into the supply chain, the scope certificates here are becoming RAF scope certificates. So RWS scope certificates will be replaced with RAF scope certificates. Under these, both RWS and RMS products are allowed. And the reason we are doing this is to allow for easier adoption of the new scopes and also easy transition for future animal fiber standards. For example, we have recently initiated the development of a responsible alpaca standard that will then fit into this RAF framework. I will now hand over to Trini, who will talk more about how the chain of custody works.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. My name is Trini, and I will tell you more about our chain of custody system. So we know that managing supply chains is really complex, and we all wish that we could simply and easily trace the source of a product as we look at a t-shirt or a garment hanging in a retailer's window. But in actuality, we know that the reality is way, way more complex, where items get traded, blended, mixed, have different paths throughout the supply chain. So to manage that challenge, we use a chain of custody system, which we see as the solution to that. And the chain of custody, the three main principles of the chain of custody are product identification, where the product has to constantly be identified. We see the second one as product segregation, and volume reconciliation as the third. And product segregation basically means that certified goods have to be separated from non-certified goods at all times and be identifiable. And volume reconciliation speaks to the fact that you are looking at outgoing certified products cannot be more than incoming products. So you reconcile what goes out does match what came in. So the aim of the chain of custody is to preserve the identity of the claimed material, and our standards use a system of transaction certificates and scope certificates. And a scope certificate is verifying that a company is certified to a given standard and allowed to produce to a given standard, whereas the transaction certificate travels with the material throughout the supply chain. So next, let's look at a couple of different questions. We often receive questions around our standards and how it works. So let's look at the most common ones, which are the 6 that you see here on the screen. So let's start with how to get started. So steps 1, 2, 3 are really on the brand side, is to reflect on making a commitment to preferred fibers and materials, to set a target for volumes, and to define the qualities and the quantities. And I'm now going to talk a little bit more about points 4, 5, and 6. So one way is to partner with your supply chain, and there are 2 ways on how to possibly do that. We always recommend to work with your existing supply chain, but there is also the opportunity to tap into already certified suppliers. And we have a list of certified companies on our website that show you who is certified to our standards. And you can also utilize your Textile Exchange membership to get in touch with our supply chain partners. We have a platform called The Hub that makes it very easy to exchange information. And when it comes to working with your existing supply chain, it is very important that you understand how certification works, that you have the resources necessary to motivate and support your supply chain to get certified. So let's look closer into that. So these 3 images are snapshots of our website, and under the resources tab, or even when you go to the website, you see the Integrity and Standards website. And on that, you see a Find Certified Companies, which then jumps down to the bottom right image. And you see a database or a list more so, where you can search by standard. and you would get your results of every certified entity to a given standard. Now let's look at the certification process. So we often get the questions, well, how does certification actually work and how long does it take? So pre-pandemic, we estimated that it takes about 6 to 8 weeks. Right now, in these global times, we have to estimate a little bit longer. But the steps are very straightforward. You send an application to a certification body. You receive a quote, you review a contract, you prepare your documents for certification, you undergo an audit, you will receive an audit report that may or may not contain corrective actions. And you will, upon completion of your audit and corrective actions you have taken, you will receive a scope certificate. The steps to get certified, I've just pulled out here a little bit more. The steps to get certified are the same for every entity along the supply chain, with a selection of the CB, the application process, the audit process, undergoing the audit, and then the follow-up if needed, and the receipt of a certification decision. So we also often receive the question of how much certification costs, and it really depends because certification costs varies and is comprised of different factors. There's the application fee that plays a role, the scope and the audit fee plays a role. A big factor is actually audit travel, depending on where auditors are located, how far they have to travel, where the certified entity, to the certified entity. There are textile exchange fees as well as CB transaction certification fees. Now let's look at claims and labeling. To communicate with your supply chain, there are two types of claims that you can make to a given standard. And the first one is the general marketing claim, and the second one is the product specific claim. So now let's look at both of them in more detail. A general marketing claim really centers around a commitment, whereas the final product does not yet need to be certified. And I've posted two examples here where you can say that you're committed to sourcing RWS certified wool by year X, or that your product will be certified by year X. A product specific claim is tied to a product, and it can happen via a hang tag or an online designation. And there's certain material that has to be printed or together with the product specific claim, like the company logo, the RWS logo, the CB, as well as the certification number. And here you see a helpful graphic about who actually needs to be certified in order to be making a claim. So the ones in darker blue are the entities that will need to be certified, and the lighter blue are the non-certified organizations. And textile exchange requires at all times all sites to be certified through to the seller in the last business-to-business transaction. And depending on the supply chain, usually that is the garment manufacturer, but it can also be the brand if they keep selling on to a retailer. And you see that retailers, because they are conducting business to consumer transactions, never need to be certified. And the consumer is also out of scope. If you want to label, 3 things at minimum must be in place. And the first is the proof of a certified supply chain up to the last business to business transaction. You have to comply with our logo use and claims guide. And ACB must have approved your claim you want to make. So now we've reached question 6. What do I need to do if I want to label? Now let's look at content minimums. All of our standards have different content minimums. So let's look at the RMS RWS, where the minimum percentage to make a claim is 5%. Whereas when the percentage of the product is less than 10% of certified content, you have to list the content out individually. And I've posted 2 examples here, A and B. So you have to provide more detail if it's under 10%. We often also receive the question about blending certified material with non-certified material. And the blending with non-certified virgin wool is not permitted under the RWS, whereas you are allowed to blend with other non-certified wool that is of a different species than the RWS wool, like cashmere, yak, mohair, alpaca. However, it cannot contain, your final product cannot contain non-RWS wool. The blending with recycled wool is permitted. That's a question we receive quite often. So in terms of brand certification, as I mentioned, the certification is required up to the seller in the final business-to-business transaction, and then a brand can play a different role, how they sell on, whether or not they use wholesalers, traders, and how the supply chain works. So for a brand, the certification process and the steps that I had laid out before are the same as for every other stage in the supply chain. However, there are exemptions in place for brands that use wholesale networks, which is covered in the Content Claim Standard 2.0 under Section D. And there are different exemptions that can be made depending on how your supply chain actually looks. And I've posted the 3 here. There's the 100% claimed material. An example would be if you source only 100% certified wool in all of your products, there are certain exemptions or certain certification routes you can go. The other one is by applying a batch code at the manufacturing stage to the product itself that travels with the product. And the third one is the brand certification network for entities that have very good control over their distribution systems, where you would look at what happens after the brand would be looked at to see how you would need to certify that. And we recommend to keep those 3 exemptions in mind as you reach out to a certification body to discuss your supply chain with those 3 in mind. And that is a perfect segue into the Content Claim Standard 3.0. I just mentioned Content Claim Standard 2.0, which is our current standard that we have, and we are conducting a major revision this year. We have begun the open feedback period, which is actually almost coming to a close on May 30th, where we are collecting open feedback on our current version on the CCS 2.0. And with that information on hand, we will create issue papers where we identify key areas that our stakeholders have flagged. We will then form an international working group and conduct meetings, and together with the IWG make decisions on drafting the next version of the CCS, which will be the draft CCS 3.0. And that draft will then again go out for public consultation, where we will collect feedback from the public. We will revise that standard and then release a updated CCS 3.0 sometime next year. The current target date is May 2021. And there are different ways to participate and to provide feedback. We always want a lot of feedback because it really helps us to create a better standard moving forward. And there are 3 main ways. The first one right now, I mentioned we have the open feedback period on the CCS 2.0 that closes on May 30th. And you will see a link at the end of this presentation on how to participate. You can also participate in the international working group. And if you follow that link to the survey, you will see how to sign up for that. And then again, as a third way to provide feedback is during the draft CCS 3.0 public consultation period that will happen a little bit later. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Callie.
Thanks, Trini. So I'm going to touch a little bit more on some of the brand specific questions that we get in terms of certifying to the RWS. And these are from all stages, whether you're exploring the RWS and starting to look at what it would take to switch your sourcing over, or kind of reflecting back on some of the challenges that were found in the process. But Hannah mentioned the hub a little bit earlier, and I just wanted to kind of place some emphasis. That's a great area that we offer for collaboration and conversation. So if you are a member, that's available for you to be able to post questions and receive answers from other members. And then also, if you're part of the International Working Group, which we can still, the revision is over, but we can still have members be part of that on the hub, and that's another great place to post RWS specific questions. Excuse me, but these are the most common questions that we get both for brands and then also from brands as we're managing the inboxes and just having different conversation with brands. So we're going to dive into these top 4 questions now. So the first question is really just a high level, what's the process look like when we're first starting to explore the possibility of sourcing RWS wool? And these answers were taken from both a brand survey that we did with all of our stakeholders that are already certified to the RWS or were thinking about certifying, as well as kind of case studies that we've done with specific brands that have provided us kind of in-depth detail about their process. So a lot of the brands said that a pilot program was really helpful all the way from the farm to the knitters. So making sure that the programs that you're running are in conjunction with the entire supply chain. The fact of having previous certifications definitely helped the learning curve for some. And, you know, if the RWS is your first certification that you're looking at, or if you have another certification through Textile Exchange or through another entity, that can definitely be just a helpful starting place for kind of wrapping your head around everything that needs to happen internally to certify. But I really want to spend a couple minutes on the signal from suppliers that you're getting and kind of the engagement and education about certification. And a lot of the brands that we talk to that have successfully implemented RWS across the board have not, it's been a collaborative effort. So instead of just having a brand demand come in and kind of try to change the entire system, there's been a collaborative conversation where the suppliers are open and willing to talking about certification and trying to, you know, learn more about what they need to do in order to become certified. And one of our brands quoted that about 60 to 70% of their time was spent in this engagement and education stage. So really building those supply chain relationships and making sure that across the board you have kind of a setup for success as you then go ahead to implement. Lots of on-site visits were quoted, and then also early commitment signals for all parts of the supply chain. And I think this is part of that conversation and the relationship building, but it has to be a collaborative effort where the brands are really making commitments from the beginning that this is a all on board, we're gonna go for this together process versus you know, kind of creating a demand and then coming back later to check on how it's going, but really making sure that you're there for the suppliers and that this commitment is able to be made. So also the brand can create more detailed planning and forecasting. This will also help with pricing as you guys start to negotiate the details of the certification. And so again, coming back to that two-way communication and having a constant flow, a constant conversation, versus maybe some laid out checkpoints, having a communication that is throughout the entire process. Next slide. And if you can hear my cat in the background, I apologize. So another question we get is, how is sourcing RWS wool different from normally sourcing wool? And it's wool is a commodity, and RWS Merino, as we were first getting started with the standard back in 2016, the process for introducing a new material to the market definitely required getting it started and building the supply and the demand for it. And so that deep level of engagement with the supply chain to bring the amount of material to the market that was needed, the engagement was really crucial. Now that the standard has been around and we're in the second revision of it, I'll touch a little bit more on the supply forecast in a bit, but The deep level of engagement is still definitely necessary, but we are a little bit further along in scaling some of the scaling the material and kind of overcoming some of those initial challenges. But again, forward price and volume commitments are definitely key. This gives signals down to your supply chain that you guys are all in this together and it's a workable project for everyone. So diving into some of the challenges, like I mentioned, the availability in the beginning is something that we have, Textile Exchange has placed a lot of emphasis on trying to facilitate making sure that the supply and the demand are growing together, and we'll get into more of what's available now in a minute. Of course, with any sort of certified material, there's going to be a slight upcharge, and so that's definitely something internally that would have to be addressed. And then some brands talked about the quality concerns due to sourcing changes if you're not certifying your current supply chain, but you're looking at changing suppliers. So again, that's where the two-way communication comes into play, and the RWS does offer the great benefit of being able to directly know where the product is coming from. So there's a lot of information available from the farm groups that are RWS certified, and this can help with bringing a lot of information back to the team about the quality of the product. Another challenge some brands faced was just starting to plan out more long-term. Some of these commitments are longer planning scopes than teams had seen before. So that's something that would need to be addressed if you're used to planning in more shorter seasons. And then also the chain of custody that Trini mentioned before. There's some other types of systems that are using a mass balance system for product, and chain of custody is different depending on what type of mass balance system you're using, but each site will need to be certified. And this can just, have some added paperwork, some new internal systems that would be needed if you're looking to make on-product claims and certify all the way through the supply chain. And then this question is one of my favorite. What advice would you, being the brand, give to somebody interested in sourcing an RWS wool or designing an RWS certified product? And there were so many answers. I picked out one quote down at the bottom, I think kind of sums up everything. But essentially just spend a lot of time answering the why than the what and the how. So I think the what and the how often can be ironed out, and in the internal processes, challenges can arise and they can take time to shift over. But if the why is there and the real commitment and purpose for changing your sourcing over is there, then it becomes a journey that, this is a quote from Kathmandu, who was at our conference last year, but it really becomes a journey. So it's everybody's cause and not just yours. And I think this is really where the connection in the supply chain comes into play again. The collaboration is key. Everybody's all on board with it. The brands are sending the demand signal, and this just helps with managing the price impacts and also starting small and then scaling. I think it's easy to, get overwhelmed by a large commitment and kind of get lost in where to start. But one pilot program, one season, one supplier can really set the framework for building a great foundation for starting to transition the rest of your material. And then also just creating demand. Don't wait for consumers. I think we've seen growing demand for certified material and traceable material in the market, but it's also a huge influence for a brand to set a commitment and really lead the way on that. And Hannah is going to briefly talk about some of the growth and adoption we've seen with the standard since we launched in 2016.
Great, thank you, Callie. Before I hand back to Callie to give the supply forecast, I just wanted to share a sneak preview of from our 2019 standards report that we're working on finalizing now. So these are our draft figures. But as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got the total number of RWS certified sites. We launched in 2016, and The first 6 months were pretty much focused on getting the assurance infrastructure in place. And then we've seen a steady growth in adoption. But the chart above, the number of farms, is, I think, a better illustration of the scale of adoption that we're seeing, because most of the farm level certification is taking place through the group certification model. So one certified farm unit could have a large number of individual farm members in there. So here we can see that between 2018 and 2019, we experienced extremely strong growth from 278 certified farms to 745. And we had a very strong first quarter of 2020, so I expect that we will see this growth curve continue. And I also want to just share some numbers on the numbers of sheep. We now have 4.5 million sheep certified to the RWS, so we did at the end of 2019, and I think it's really exciting to be able to tie back to the purpose of the standard and seeing the scale of not only animals but also land that we are working with. And here you can see broken down by the key countries the amount of sheep under certification. And just a note on the last block is that we New Zealand CQ farms and individual certifications in the US and individual certifications in Australia are not included in the main figures. So that was just a little bit of a preview, and we will be releasing our performance report and also data in the preferred fibers and materials report that's coming out in June. And I will hand back to Callie now, who will talk a little bit about some of the individual grower groups and their plans.
Thanks. This is my favorite slide because of all of the very cute sheep that are on here, but you can advance to the next one, Trini. Thanks. So yeah, as I was mentioning before, one of the most important benefits, I think, for a lot of brands is knowing exactly where the RWS wool is coming from all the way back to the farm. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of our farm groups that make up the supplier network and what their current capacity is. And you guys can also see, these are pictures from the actual farms that are associated with the sheep that are from the actual farms. So all of these capacity, supply capacity numbers that I'm going to give, you can kind of look at the sheep and know that this picture is exactly where it's coming from, which I think is really, really sweet. So Llanos Trinidad, they're one of our original partners, and the contact information is down at the bottom there for all of these farms. But Pedro has been a really engaged member of the International Working Group for since the beginning, and his capacity right now is 1.1 million kilograms of wool tops. And you can see the different micron ranges that are available there. The shearing takes place from July to October, but they're running year round, so they have the tops available all year. And when asked about the plans for growth, it's kind of what we were talking about before. So it's very easy for them to grow their farm group, and when more demand comes, they'll continue to grow that effort. So that is Llanos Trinidad, and then we can move on to Fox and Lily. Fox and Lily, their contact information again at the bottom there. They're based out of Australia, and they have producers, 65, more than 65 wool producers from all over the area. And so they have 2.75 million kilograms per year, and most of it is 19 micron, but they also have plans to grow their capacity with some of the higher micron qualities there. With the timing, they're looking at all year availability for the greasy and raw wool supply, and then their processing is mostly year round, and they work together individually with the clients to kind of plan the turnaround for that. And they're continuing to grow their Genesis farm group, and are making plans to grow that at the speed that the demand continues to grow for RWS wool. And next slide. Great. And Shaniko Wool Company, some of you may know Jeannie. She is a force of nature and a US wool farmer that just has an amazing piece of land. I think it's up in Oregon. And so she is currently at 20,000 pounds of RWS certified tops, and that's about 21.1 microns, and is starting to take reservations for the greasy wool by May 30th. So that is coming up in a couple days here. And so that she has some inventory that's available immediately to ship, and then looking to grow their combed tops by mid-July. And again, looking to double their wool production by 2022. I think Hannah mentioned it earlier, but Jeannie has some really amazing plans to start to incorporate land impact data and carbon data into her production. So that effort is something that we're definitely looking to get updates on, and is exciting to see some of the farm groups start to pilot advanced techniques like that. BKB here, they are looking at 8 million kilograms of RWS wool, which is a huge amount. They have a huge farm group. Most of it will be available between August 2020, February 2021, and they are focusing mostly on the mohair industry. Their RWS supply is pretty established, and with the new RAF framework, they're looking to get the mohair scope added to their farm group. So next update, we should see a lot of our MS certified material coming from them as well, and the contact for ESAC is down at the bottom there. And we'll be sending out these slides after the presentation, so any contact information that anyone's looking for can be taken from that. And then the Schneider Fuhrman group, they have about 750 greasy tons of RWS material, starting availability from July 2020 onward. And the next 3 years, they're looking at 2,000 tons. And they're based out of Argentina, and so they're constantly incorporating new farms to the program, both in Australia and New Zealand. And they have a group certification model that is looking to grow their base as the demand for RWS material grows as well. And Willie's contact is down there at the bottom. And that's it for the supply forecast. Again, if you guys have any questions about specifics, or want to get in touch with any of the suppliers individually, feel free to reach out. And we're just gonna also pop this slide in here. I'm not gonna go in depth about the resources, but just know that there's a wealth of knowledge available on our website, responsiblewool.org. We have some trainings on brand certification that are recorded sessions. I think they're no, this one is one part, it's one training, but that's about the CCS 2.0, which is very helpful if you're starting to explore the brand certification or the supply chain certification. As Trini mentioned, we're also revising the content claim standards. So this is a great opportunity for brands who have already been through the process, or brands that are starting to wrap their mind around the process and are thinking, oh, that would be more workable if that standard was written this way, or this requirement, incorporated this aspect of what we're dealing with. So we're welcoming all feedback on the current standard, and also encouraging folks to join the international working group, where we're going to be breaking into some of the issues and kind of getting into the nitty gritty of revising the current standard. We have the supply certification graphic that is linked there. That's kind of the intro to everything RWS and supply chain certification. And then also, like Hannah mentioned, the webinar that we did when the RWS 2.0 and RMS 1.0 launched. And that has more of an overview on the standard specific and what changed from version 1.0 to 2.0. And then again, just our email address down there. I manage the Responsible Wool inbox, and Trini manages the standards inbox. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and yeah, we can kind of go from there. And we encourage everybody to, there's no question too big and no question too small. We're here to kind of help start the process, or continue the process, or connect you with different folks if you have questions. So yeah, please use this as a resource, and feel free to follow up with us after the webinar. And I'll hand it back to Rose now.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so we will start with a question that I know that Hannah, you would like to answer, and I'll just read it here for everyone. If the RWS is blended with recycled wool, do we have to distinguish between their percentage of recycled wool versus the percentage of RWS? Hannah?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag this one to say that in the RWS logo use and claims guide, we do have a requirement that claims that are not related to the standard has to be kept at a reasonable distance. So we will provide an example in the notes of what that could look like. So just wanted to flag that we don't prohibit making claims alongside the RWS, and we will provide more detail on what that could look like. And there was another question along the same lines around blending and different standard claims.
I'll go ahead and read that for everyone, and then if you'd like to address that, that would be great.
Okay.
The question is, if a product is made of blending of two fibers, like 85% organic cotton and 5% elastane and 10% RWS wool, can we sell the product under two different standards like GOTS and RWS?
Okay, so yes, we combined claims to different textile exchange standards are absolutely fine. However, I just wanted to flag that with GOTS, that would not, that would only be possible if it was organic and RWS certified at the farm level. So for example, I believe the Fuhrman group in Argentina are both organic and RWS, so then it would be possible to have a combined GOTS and RWS claim, but otherwise it wouldn't. So you have to check very carefully that the both sets of requirements are met.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, do we know the obstacles to greater adoption in Australia, New Zealand, the US?
That's a great question. I think the demand signal is the key to driving adoption at the farm level. We do facilitate an RWS roundtable. We meet in person at the Textile Exchange Conference, and we're currently planning for what we will do this year, which is a sort of a forum to explore barriers to adoption at all parts of the supply chain, as well as connecting the different parts of the supply chain. So I think that falls in the category of a very big question, and it's one that we are definitely keen to explore through the RWS roundtable community.
Great. I don't see any additional questions. If you have any questions, now would be a good time to submit those. And while that's happening, Hannah, do you have any closing remarks before we close today's webinar?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to Callie and Trini for presenting.
Yes, thank you to you, the presenters. And as a friendly reminder, again, to this presentation will be sent with links to the audio as well as the slide deck to all registered participants. So you'll receive that within 24 hours, usually goes out next day. And again, thank you to everyone for participating, and hope you have a pleasant day. Goodbye.